Good morning again.
Morning.
We're going to be in John chapter 9. And today we're going to be speaking about sanctified suffering. Sanctified suffering. And we're going to be talking about the man that was born blind in John chapter 9, starting in verse 1. Now, previously, Jesus, he was teaching and confronting the Pharisees in the temple courts. And now Jesus, he has slipped away from the temple grounds because they tried to stone him. And in chapter 9, verse 1, as he went along, he saw a man born blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" In verse 3, Jesus said, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." So it is the case, we know this, and we see this in the scriptures, that from time to time, for one reason or another, God will test people. We do something wrong, and maybe he'll give us a hurdle to jump over. He'll chastise us and teach us a lesson. But it is also the case, like Jesus says here, that it happens sometimes that is not the case. Sometimes, as he says, this happens so that the works of God might be displayed. And so there's various reasons we suffer. There's various reasons we struggle. And the point is to suffer well. If Jesus was not above suffering, we're not above suffering. And so we have to learn to suffer well. And if we suffer well, we suffer right. That's, I think, a means of grace. It can be a means of grace. And when you think about a means of grace, it's easy to think about the Scriptures. The Scriptures are a means of grace. It's easy to think about the things that we do in church, worship, the Lord's Supper, and baptism. These things are means of grace. But it is hard to think about suffering as a means of grace. There are various ways in which suffering can be a means of grace. There is the sort of suffering, this first sort where you've done something wrong or you've erred, or maybe you're going through a period in your life where God has to give you a hurdle to jump over. That's one kind of means of grace. That's where you are the recipient of the means of grace. You are growing from your suffering. But there is another kind of suffering that is a means of grace. And that is the sort of suffering, the sort of means of grace where maybe you are edified, but other people are edified because of your suffering, and they also grow. And so God, in his sovereignty, he placed this man here, a man blind from birth, that his works might be displayed in him. In verse 4, Jesus says, "As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world," he says, "I am the light of the world." In Jesus' day, during Jesus' ministry, he did a work. And there was works that he did, miracles that he did, things that he did that were special and unique to Jesus' ministry. Jesus says we've got to work while I'm in the world, because there's a time coming when I won't be in the world. But something interesting about this, I think, is that while the light of the world, he's not in the world. The light of the world is still here. The light may not be in the world, but he's still in us. And I think that's something unique about suffering. You look out in the world and people in the world, it's very hard to suffer well when you're a secular, unsaved person. There are people that do it. Secular people that they seem to suffer well. But it is much easier to suffer and suffer well, to have a sanctified suffering when Jesus is living in you. When Jesus is helping you. The light of the world who is in the world in his day in that ministry, he is in us now in the church presently. And so who else are you going to go to for help or for counseling and guidance on how to suffer well than the suffering servant? And so we have this assurance that if you want to suffer well, you absolutely can. It is within each of our reach to suffer well because Christ is living in us. In verse 6, after saying this, he spit on the ground and he made some mud with the saliva and he put it on the man's eyes. Now, for us today, we're a very germophobic, sort of clean culture. That sort of sends chills down your spine, but it wasn't a big deal. It isn't really now. In verse 7, Jesus told him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. That word for Siloam means sent. And so the man, he went and he washed and he came home seeing. Previously in John, I spoke about Jesus as the light of the world in relation to Jesus as the Creator. As Jesus, Genesis chapter 1, I believe that was Jesus. And so I think it's interesting to me that Jesus, talking about this blind man, this man born blind, prepared by God for a mighty work, that Jesus in that context says, again, he says, "I am the light of the world." And then he makes mud and he puts it on the man's eyes and he is made whole again. That's reminiscent, if you know Genesis, of Jesus, Jesus, forming man out of the dust of the earth. So here's Jesus, the light of the world. Here's this man who's been prepared for this mighty work. And what is the mighty work? But the Creator fixing the creature. Jesus is the potter, the man is the clay. And so he puts it on his eyes and he tells him to go wash, and the man, he obeys, he goes. I think it's sort of funny that Jesus sends him to the pool of the scent to wash. It's sort of a funny way to word that, but the man went and he washed and he came home seeing. In verse 8, we finally start to see how it is that this man is, his suffering is a means of grace in the second sense. In verse 8, his neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was. Others said, "No, he only looks like him." But he himself insisted, "I am the man." In verse 10 they asked, "How then were your eyes opened?" And in verse 11 he replied, "The man they call Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see." And they asked him, "Where is this man?" And he said, "I don't know." Isn't that interesting? Jesus, he heals him. There's this man born blind. He heals this man, and he just keeps going. And when it comes down to it, and they ask him, "Where is this man?" He's like, "I don't know. He just healed me and kept going." I find that sort of interesting. It makes for quite the scene. So here is this man born blind. He had never seen anything in his whole life. And the first thing he sees is his Creator, Jesus Christ. And he heals his eyes. In the same way that Jesus knit him together in his mother's womb, Jesus puts him back together again and he fixes him. And then he goes on as if that was an everyday thing. And for Jesus it was. That was the kind of work that was done when he was in the world. And this man, as a means of grace, he goes back home. And the people that knew him previously are very confused. I know you are blind, and what has happened? And this makes an opportunity for the formerly blind man, to tell them about Jesus Christ. And so while he's not in the world in the way that he was in this passage, and he's maybe not doing the exact same miracles as often as he was doing them here, Jesus, living in each one of us, is still doing a work. And so when you are going through life and you experience temptation and you resist, when you're going through suffering and you hold on through it and you suffer well, people notice that and are confused. Because like I said, generally speaking, the world doesn't suffer well. They don't know how to cope with suffering. Because for them, as far as they're concerned, this world's all they've got. And so when things seem bleak, they don't have a God to look to, or a resurrection to look to, or a new life to look forward to. But we do. And we have God in us testifying that, listen, you're going to come out of this. There is a prerogative for you to suffer well. And then he encourages us to do that. And so while we can be a testimony to people, it's not in the same way as the blind man. There's not many people I know that were born blind and are no longer. When you suffer well, you too are a testimony, a means of grace to other people that you are different. And then when people ask, you can tell them. You can say, I don't know where he went, but he touched me, like that song, like the hymn. He touched me, he healed me. But it's really funny. The whole chapter 9 actually is about this same story. The whole chapter is about the man born blind. And so in verse 13, it says that they brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. So first he goes to his family friends and his family, the people that knew him, neighbors. And now they've brought the man to the Pharisees. In verse 14, we're told that the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath, so it was a Saturday. Therefore, the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. And the man replied, he put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and now I see. In verse 16, some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. Now let's explain. The Sabbath, they had all these complex rules. Now, they weren't all biblical, but they had a lot of them. Rules about what you could do on Saturday. One of those was that you could not make mud or clay in the context of construction, so you couldn't work. You couldn't make mud or clay for maybe building a house or doing a well or whatever. Is that what Jesus did here? Was he building a house or digging a well? No. But they don't care. They've got him on a technicality, and they're going to hold him there if they can. They say, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others asked, and this is a good question, how can a sinner perform such signs? So they were divided. We have a lot of, false miracle workers and false teachers and people that they pretend to do big things, but you look close enough and it's pretty easily false. You can tell it's a lie. But how on earth? This isn't something you can fake. He was blind. Now he wasn't. That's simple. Jesus didn't stick around and take his savings. Jesus healed him, kept walking. He did all he knew was his name. That's hard to fake. So how can a sinner perform such signs? And so even the Pharisees were divided. And the man, well, verse 17, then they turned again to the blind man. What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened. And the man replied, he's a prophet. There's no way. He can't not be. He must be a prophet. And in verse 18, they still did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. And they asked, is this your son? Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that now he can see? And the parents answered in verse 20, we know he is our son, and we know he was born blind, but how he can now see, or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him, he is of age, he will speak for himself. And his parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders, who already decided that anyone who acknowledged Jesus as the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. So that was why his parents said, he is of age, ask him. So they're bringing all these witnesses, but they have already decided if they get the wrong answer out of these witnesses, the answer they don't like, they're going to put him out of the synagogue. And so they say, hey, we don't know, ask him. Well, they've already asked him. They already know the answer. So verse 24, a second time they summoned the man who had been blind. And they said, give glory to God by telling the truth. We know this man is a sinner. And in verse 25 he replied, whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. You know, there's this emphasis, this push to, you've got to be very particular with the Scriptures. You've got to be very scholarly with the Scriptures. And that's true. It's good to be particular with the Scriptures. But there's this idea that you have to, I've got to say all the right things. If I'm going to witness to someone, I've got to say all the right things. I must have I'll wait till I get a PhD or something before I witness about the Scriptures, before I witness about Jesus. No. The witness is this, and it's super simple. I was blind, but now I see. It's that complex right there. It's that simple. I was blind, but now I see. The Scriptures tell us elsewhere that, he will give us the words. If you're brought before someone important to witness to them, Jesus will give you the words. He'll sort it out. And just like we read here, he sorted it out. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. And that was the words right there. Those were the words. And in verse 26, they asked him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? They already know. He's already told them. And he answered in the same way, verse 27. He answered, I have told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? And then he says this, do you want to become his disciples too? Now, I don't know if for his sake he should have said that, but I think that was probably just the right words. Do you want to be his disciples too? And then in verse 28, they hurled insults at him and said, you are this fellow's disciple? We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses. But as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from. But that's not the question, is it? The question is not whether you know where he comes from. The question is whether God spoke to him. And we already have the answer. They themselves are divided on it. How can a sinner perform such signs? Nicodemus, when he came to Jesus in the night, he says, we know you're from God because of these signs that you do, the way that you teach. Yet again, like we read in the previous passages, they are liars. They know the truth, but they don't want to be set free. And in verse 30, the man answered, now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. And this is a blind beggar teaching Pharisees. Listen to this. Verse 31. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. This is a blind or formerly blind beggar teaching Pharisees. That doesn't read like a beggar. That reads like a teacher. And verse 34, to this they replied, you were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? And they threw him out. Like I said, liars. What did Jesus say? Neither this man nor his parents sinned. That's a lie. He was not steeped in sin from birth. We call that projection. They were projecting. And they knew it, were steeped in sin. In verse 35, Jesus heard that they had thrown him out. And when he found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? And the man asked, who is he, sir? Tell me so that I may believe in him. And Jesus said, you have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you. Then the man said, Lord, I believe. And he worshipped him. And in verse 39, Jesus said, for judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind. And some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this and asked, what? Are we blind too? And Jesus answered, if you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains. Listen. If you know better, like the Pharisees knew better, don't boast that you know more than everybody else. Don't boast that you're a Christian, because you didn't do that anyway. God did that in you. But don't boast of your religion, because all that means, you know what that means? All that means is you know better. When the world sins, they're just doing what they do. That's in their nature. When the world sins, that's just the world being the world. When we sin, we know better. And the Pharisees, looking down their nose, all their judgments, Jesus says, whatever you measure to this person, it will be measured back to you.